Base running. It's been an integral part of baseball since its inception for obvious reasons. If you're hitting, you have to run the bases at some point. The best batters will be the ones who are on the bases the most, but those skills don't transfer one-to-one. You could be an amazing hitter and then your brain suddenly shuts off on a ground ball to the left side while you're on second. The best base runners are usually the fastest guys in the league, but you don't have to be a speed demon to make an impact on the base paths. Sometimes you just have to be smart. You could easily argue that a high base running IQ is just as important as being quick. Not every guy runs out a ground ball, but sometimes rushing the internal clock of the fielder can do wonders for yourself. Or how about making split-second decisions on whether to extend a single into a double? You could hit a rocket off the left field wall that is almost always a double, but then you get absolutely gunned down because the left fielder played the ball perfectly. Or how about deciding to go from first to third on a teammate's single? Being fast is undoubtedly important, but being aware of the skills of each fielder and their arm strength, the pitcher's tendencies to throw off-speed and breaking pitches in certain situations, knowing which catchers are the most proficient at nabbing runners, or deciding to take that extra base is just as integral. These are things that require a different kind of mindset on top of being a gifted runner. So, we know base running is a very important part of the game, and you probably didn't need me to tell you that, but it's important to make sure the basics of base running are understood for what this video is focusing on. For this video, we're going back about 14 years to 2010, when the Tampa Bay Rays were the best team in the American League and finished the year with a record of 96 and 66. On the other hand, the Kansas City Royals were one of the worst teams in the AL, finishing with a record of 67 and 95. These two teams were just a game apart from their records being an exact reverse of one another. But beyond that, why are we focusing on these two teams? Well, if you could guess, this has to do with their base running. The Rays were easily the best base running team in the league in 2010 in terms of BSR, and the Royals were easily the worst base running team that year when it comes to BSR. So we already have a very contrasting situation of the best team and one of the worst, and the best base runners and the worst base runners. But it gets even better. The Rays are not just the best base running team in 2010, they are the best base running team of the 21st century. As for the Royals, they're not just the worst base running team of 2010 either, they're the worst base running team of the 21st century. From 30 teams to 720, these two are still at the top and bottom of it all respectively. But let's keep going. How about back to 1990? 998 teams and it's still these two. How about 1980? Now we're at 1,258 different teams and we still have the 2010 Rays at number 1 and the 2010 Royals at number 1,258. We might as well keep going. What's it look like if we go back to 1970? The 2010 Rays are at number 1 and the 2010 Royals are still in dead last at number 1,504. It'll take you till 1929 to find a team with a worse BSR than the 2010 Royals and 1915 for a team with a better BSR than the 2010 Rays. That is pretty crazy, but there are some issues with comparing BSR further and further into the past, and I think before we dive into the heroics and horrifics of this base running duo, we need to go over a few things. While I was going over the historic rankings of these two 2010 teams, you might have heard me using a stat called BSR to determine that list. So of course, I think we should go over what is BSR. If you're in the dark as to why I'm using it or what that stat even is, you'll know what it all means soon enough. BSR is a stat that stands for base running, and a player or team's total BSR represents how many runs they have created via the base paths. BSR just so happens to also be the only base running component that Fangraphs uses when calculating their version of wins above replacement, in case you were wondering. BSR is made up of 3 base running stats, and while I don't want to get into the specifics of how these are calculated, but I do think they need to be mentioned for a few reasons I'll get to in a second. These 3 stats are weighted stolen bases, ultimate base running, and weighted grounded into double play runs, which is a long name. So I'll just be referring to all of these as their abbreviations cause it's easier. WSB is essentially if you were to combine the positive value of stolen bases and the negative value of getting caught stealing. UBR is advancing bases on balls in play while you're already on base and not getting thrown out trying to stretch for extra bases on your own hits. And WGDP finds how often someone prevents themselves from grounding into double plays. So if you were wondering, no, it's not just stolen bases that make up base running. There's a lot more to the skill of base running than that. Therefore, BSR is the all-encompassing stat to represent base running as a whole. That's all you need to know. Oh, and also 0 is considered the average BSR, and anything above or below that number is above or below league average. The same goes for each of the parts that make up BSR. So in that case, a BSR like CJ Abrams' 9.2 in 2023 is 9.2 base running runs above league average, if that makes sense. So what are the limitations here though? I alluded to earlier that there are some caveats as I started to compare MLB teams further and further into the past. There are a few reasons for that. First of all, before 1950, caught stealing was not really being tracked consistently. That's a big part of our stat that becomes unreliable once we pass the 1950s, and therefore I don't think it's entirely fair to compare teams prior to that time. Second, UBR, a third of our BSR stat, didn't exist before 2002. Again, that's a large part of what we're looking at, and if we compare the 2010 teams to years before 2002, it's not exactly the most fair comparison. So while I think it's incredibly impressive that it takes until 1929 for one of these two teams to budge from their spot, it's an imperfect comparison. When it comes to looking at an entire team's BSR, they're just adding together the BSR values for every player on the team. It's just like any other team's counting stat kind of thing. Now that we have all that information out of the way, we should get to the first of our two focuses, one of the best base running teams of all time, the 2010 Tampa Bay Rays. So, in 2010, the Rays had just come off a season in 2009 where they finished 84-78 and didn't make the playoffs. In the grand scheme of Rays baseball up until this point, it's actually a very good year for them. After 2009, the Rays had only been around for 12 seasons at this point, and that year was one of 2 times where they finished above 500. Unlike their 1998 expansion National League counterparts and the Diamondbacks, it took a while before the Rays had a good season. The only other season that the Rays finished above 500 was 2008, where they went all the way to the World Series but fell short of a championship. They lost 4-1 to the Philadelphia Phillies. Something interesting that I want to point out is just last year in 2023, the Marlins actually made the playoffs with the exact same record as the 2009 Rays, finishing 84-78 and snagging the last wildcard spot in the NL. But back in 2009, playoff spots were a lot more tight. Nowadays, we have 12 teams that make the playoffs, 3 division winners and 3 wildcards. Before that, there were 10 teams, 3 division winners and 2 wildcards, and in 2009, there was just 1 wildcard spot with the 3 division winners, meaning that unless you won your division, you needed to have the best record among the 12 remaining teams. Unluckily for the Rays, the AL East was unsurprisingly stacked, with the Yankees finishing with 103 wins and the Red Sox finishing with 95. With only 1 wildcard spot, they weren't even close. Now you could say to me, well, the Marlins made the playoffs, but they got completely shelled by the Phillies. The same would have happened to the Rays. That's fair enough, but you could also consider the fact that the Arizona Diamondbacks also snagged a wildcard spot last year with the exact same record as the Marlins. They may not have won it all, but they came awfully close. Over a decade ago, they would have been nowhere near the playoffs, let alone the World Series. To make matters worse, this Rays team had a dreadful losing streak in September, losing 11 straight games. So although this may have been the Rays' second best season in their short lifespan, it was a disappointment. Despite the lack of historical success, there were definitely higher hopes than third place in the division and 11 games back of the playoffs. Now, going into 2010, the Rays had hoped to bounce back and make it to the playoffs once again, and they did just that, winning the division with a record of 96-66, just 1 game up on the Yankees, snagging that division title in the last few games of the season. 2010 was possibly the most star-studded a Rays lineup has ever been, considering the team is not really known for their stars. They got prime seasons from David Price, Evan Longoria, and Carl Crawford. Ben Zobrist and Carlos Pena were pretty big names for them too, although they didn't hit quite at the level they probably wanted to. So I would say this is the most star-studded roster the Rays have ever had. They had 4 All-Stars this year, tied for the second most they've ever had. But now that we've gone over what this team looked like heading into and during the 2010 season, how was their base running? Well, I already told you that the Rays have the highest BSR out of teams in the 21st century and potentially beyond with 37.6. But let's see what else they were good at. Since 2002, they rank 15th in WSB, 10th in WGDP, and 6th in UBR. So this team wasn't really at the top of any of the three stats that make up base running that I went over earlier, but when it's all combined, they end up with a pretty staggering lead. If we look at the base running rankings from 2002 to 2023 again, the Rays are in first by 14 BSR. There's a bigger gap between first and second place than there is between second and 102nd place. That's how much better the 2010 Rays were when it came to base running. While you'd naturally think they would be at the top of the three components of BSR as well, it's actually very difficult for a team to be above average at all three of these stats. Overall, the 2010 Rays placed 48th in position player WAR since 2002 with 30.9. As I said earlier, BSR is the one and only thing that makes up the base running part of Fangraphs' WAR, so after a quick calculation, we find out that the Rays' 37.6 BSR results in about 3.9 of their 30.9 FWAR that year. Now, that may seem like a very small part of it, but it's important to keep in mind that hitting will always be the most valuable, with fielding coming in right after it. Still, 3.9 FWAR strictly through highly skilled and crafty base running is a huge feat. For a team that had a slightly above average WRC plus with 106, that can do wonders for your run production. In case anyone doesn't know, here's a quick rundown of WRC+. It's a hitting stat where 100 is the league average, and anything above or below it is above or below average. So the Rays as a whole were 6% above league average. OPS Plus works the same way, and they usually are pretty close to one another, so think of it as kinda like that. WRC Plus is just meant to represent offensive value as a whole, minus base running of course. For a division-winning team, hitting stats like that are really nothing spectacular, but the Rays were able to gain great value in the lesser areas. Next, let's break down each part of the 37.6 BSR that made up this team. Now, this is going to take into account every single possible base runner the Rays had in 2010. Which means we have 37 different players that make up this number. But there's a lot of guys we can cut out here to trim the fat a little bit, starting off with the pitchers. Although this is the American League, this was well before the universal DH, so interleague games would follow the rules of whoever was the home team, and so the Rays had 18 interleague games, with half of them going by the National League rules that made pitchers hit. Most pitchers, especially in the American League, were not likely to get on base. Even if a pitcher did make an appearance on the bases in those very few games, they were so few and far between that it still resulted in all their BSRs being 0.0. So we can get rid of all the pitchers. Now this leaves us with 20 players, and that's a lot more digestible. We have the Rays' starting 9 and the bench players they had throughout the season. And so now's the time to really take a deep dive into what made this Rays base running so historic. I'm not going to highlight everyone on the team, but I do want to talk about the team's biggest contributors, both good and bad. In this full list of 20 players, only 6 people put up a BSR that negatively impacted the team, which is really good. Funnily enough, the guys who made the most negative impact on the team's base running were players who honestly barely even played. Let's start off with Hank Blaylock, who had the 3rd worst BSR on the team with negative 1.0. Blaylock played in just 26 games and only started 15 of them. He didn't play on the team until mid-May and was DFA'd in June. He didn't continue playing on any team that season, so we don't have much to work with here, but for counting stats at least, he grounded into 1 double play, stole 1 base, and got caught stealing 1 time. Here's how his BSR breaks down. If you remember, UBR is all about advancing bases in various scenarios, and that's what Blaylock was the worst at. For such a limited amount of playing time, that's going to negatively hurt your production. Blaylock's 1 caught stealing was also a pretty rough one. In this Rays-Rangers game, he jumped far too early in a situation where he was stealing from 2nd to 3rd. The Rays were down 3 runs already in this game, and it was only the top of the 2nd. Plus, he was already in scoring position, and I'd say the risk was definitely not worth it for a guy with only 14 career stolen bases. I think he's much more likely to score on a single or better from 2nd than to steal 3rd and then try to score on something like a sac fly. Not to mention, guess what happened right after this? Just a few pitches later, Sean Rodriguez hit a solo shot that obviously would have put 2 runs on the board if Blaylock hadn't gotten himself out. But instead, it's just 1 run on the board. Moving down to the guy with the second worst BSR on the team, that would be Pat Burrell, with a BSR of -1.1. Pat Burrell was a really good bat in the 2000s. In his first 9 MLB seasons, he was a regular starter on the Phillies and slashed .257, .367, .485 for an OPS of .852, an OPS plus of .119, and 251 career homers. He was a great and pretty consistent hitter until he joined the Rays. He must have hated Tampa or something, because once the Rays signed him for a 2-year deal in 2009, he was pretty awful for them. In Burrell's 146 games with the Tampa Bay Rays in 2009 and 2010, he slashed .218, .311, .361 for an OPS of .672. That is clearly well below what he's been able to accomplish in his career, but maybe it's just natural regression? Well, Burrell ended up being DFA'd in mid-May, around the same time as Blaylock, but unlike Blaylock, Burrell came back with a vengeance. He got picked up by the Giants at the start of June, and it was like he was right back in career form. In 96 games for the San Francisco Giants, Burrell slashed .266, .364, .509 for an OPS of .872 while launching 18 home runs. He helped the Giants to a World Series appearance and got his second career ring by the end of it. He did pretty awful in the World Series, but still. He hit more home runs in his 96 games with San Fran than in his 146 games with Tampa. So you can see why I said this dude might have just hated the Rays. Beyond the poor hitting in his time with the team, his -1.1 BSR definitely made things worse. And while he had no stolen base attempts at all, he grounded into 2 double plays, and just like Blaylock, UBR is what hurt him the most. Again, since he didn't make any stolen base attempts, we don't have much footage to work with, but I did try to find situations where Burrell failed to pounce on the chance to advance extra bases. Here's an example in this Rays-Red Sox game on April 19th, where Burrell hits a high fly ball off the monster, but gets gunned down trying to get to second base. I mean, it was a pretty solid relay, but nothing crazy, and it was a fly ball. So there were about 7 seconds before that ball hit the left fielder's glove, and then he was out by a mile. With a better relay and throw, Burrell honestly would have been out halfway to second. Although this is probably a double in many other situations, sometimes you just have to be aware of not only the scenario you're in, but also your own capabilities. That kind of situation will hurt your UBR and therefore your base running. Lastly, the worst base runner on the 2010 Tampa Bay Rays is none other than the catcher Dioner Navarro. Navarro was actually once an all-star for the Rays in 2008, but at this point, his 53 OPS plus in the following years is what put him in backup catcher status. Not only that, but Navarro had the 3rd most games played out of catchers on the team with 48, so he wasn't even the first backup option. However, even as he lost playing time to 2 other catchers, he made a massive impact on the base paths. Negatively, Navarro put up -3.2 BSR, which is almost as much as all the other negative contributors combined. So it's clear that even in his short playing time, he was a horrendous base runner. A quick glance at his counting stats shows us 1 caught stealing, with 0 stolen bases and 3 times where he grounded into a double play. That BSR is made up of these numbers, and once again the theme of UBR continues, as a large portion of Navarro's base running woes is due to that stat. It did not take long for me to find situations where we could see this in a game. In this Blue Jays-Rays game on June 2nd in Tropicana Field, you can certainly see that Navarro wasn't exactly a speedster. On a BJ Upton fly ball to fairly deep right field, Navarro was easily out trying to tag up and score. Now, I just want to remind everyone that 1 or 2 situations aren't representative of every base running opportunity a guy has, but I think it's better to showcase some examples to justify why these guys have the stats they have. Navarro had a rough year on the base paths, to say the least. Now it's time to get to the elite base runners. Just like before, I'm going to focus on the top 3 on the team, but instead, the best base runners. Ben Zobrist comes in at 3rd best on the team with a BSR of 6.9. Zobrist was a breakout star for the Rays after his season in 2009 where he slashed .297, .405, .543 for an OPS of .948 and an OPS plus of .149 in 152 games. He ended up placing 8th in MVP voting and got his first All-Star appearance. It looked like the Rays had gotten themselves an absolute stud out of nowhere. However, Zobrist had a rough year at the plate in 2010. Playing 151 games, Zobrist slash 238, 346, 353 for an OPS of 699 and an OPS plus of 96. It seemed like his plate discipline remained steady, but his hitting was down and his slugging was way down. But Zobrist still ended up with an F4 of 3.8, which is very good. While most of that is because of his elite defense that year, the base running played a part in it too. Zobrist's 6.9 BSR ranks 12th in all of baseball that year, and there are still 2 more guys on this team above him. I'm gonna leave those guys secret for now though. If we look at the counting stats, Zobrist stole 24 bases in 27 attempts, getting caught stealing just 3 times. I believe the ideal stolen base success rate is around 75%. It kind of varies, but that's the rule of thumb. Stolen bases really skyrocketed in Major League Baseball last year with the rule changes, so I'm not sure how this might have changed, but since we're focusing on 2010, it shouldn't really matter. The average stolen base rate in 2010 though was 72%, so Zobrist was well above that and the 75% mark, with 89%. Zobrist was positive in each component of BSR, with WSB and UBR being the most efficient parts. So with 24 stolen bags and a great success rate, that gives us an easy look into his base running success. This was also the most stolen bases he's had in a season of his career. That, in combination with an elite proficiency at taking extra bases in optimal moments, leads to his 3rd best on the team BSR. Coming in at 2nd place on the 2010 Rays is BJ Upton. Upton's career is defined by his elite speed, as he put up multiple 40-plus stolen base seasons and swiped 300 total bags in his career. His 8.2 BSR ranked 2nd on the team and 7th in all of baseball that year. Like Zobrist, all the stats that make up his BSR were positive, with 4.4 WSB being the result of 42 stolen bases and 51 attempts. That's an 82% success rate on over 40 stolen bags, which is of course very good. Across his career, it ranks as his 2nd best success rate in a season, so it was one of Upton's best years running the bases too. Upton grounded into 13 double plays this season, which is a decent amount, but considering his positive WGDP, he likely broke himself out of a lot of situations where he could have been doubled up. Since Upton was so good at snagging an extra base, here's a situation where you can see exactly how that contributed to his UBR. On April 21st, in a game between the Rays and the White Sox in Chicago, Upton had a shattered bat bloop single in the 4th inning. This resulted in a run coming in at home and the throw going to 3rd base. Due to Upton's great speed and awareness, he was able to advance easily to 2nd base because of the throw. Once the next batter, our good pal Pat Burrell, came up to the plate, his sacrifice fly resulted in a throw at home where Upton yet again got to advance a base because of a throw directed to another location. So now Upton's at 3rd. Moving along, Gabe Kapler poked a single through the infield to score Upton from 3rd. Upton probably would have scored on this from 2nd since it slowly rolled into the outfield, but you can never know what would have been the case beforehand. The difference between this and a subpar base runner is probably a situation where they don't move up on the throw and then can't tag up, leaving them at 2nd after the Kapler single instead of scoring as he did. It's the kind of thing that snowballs over time instead of being one singular instance of elite base running. Finally, we've reached the number 1 spot on the Tampa Bay Rays. The best base runner on the best base running team is none other than Carl Crawford. Crawford is definitely one of the best 5-tool players of this era, and he had been an established star in the Rays for years up until this point, but 2010 might have been the best year of them all. In 154 games, Crawford slashed 307, 356, 495 for an OPS of 851 with an OPS plus of 135. That is easily Crawford's highest OPS plus in a season, and his elite defense and base running added onto that led him to a 7.7 F4 season. Among all players in Major League Baseball that year, it ranks just 2nd behind Josh Hamilton. His teammate Evan Longoria is right behind him at 3rd with 7.5 F4. Now, this team's 37.6 BSR wasn't solely the work of Crawford, but he still had an absolutely ridiculous season as a base runner. Crawford contributed to roughly a 1/3 of the Rays BSR in 2010 with 13.3. That ranks number 1 in all of baseball that year, and now that we see the full rankings, we've got 3 Rays in the top 12, Zobrist at 12, Upton at 7, and Crawford at number 1. It's also the best base running season that Crawford has put up in his entire career. So Crawford accomplished his best hitting and best base running season in the same year. With a season like this, I think it's time to broaden our scope beyond just 2010. Since 2002, Crawford's 2010 season ranks as the 8th best single season BSR, with just 1 point separating him and Mike Trout in first place. So we've truly got an all-time base running season on our hands here. It looks like when we break down his BSR, it's pretty even across the board. Crawford stole 47 bases and was caught stealing 10 times, leading to a success rate of 82%. He had a couple of 3 stolen base games under his belt as well. This is also the best WGDP we've seen thus far, as Crawford only grounded into 2 double plays the entire year. Therefore, I think we should take this opportunity to look at some examples where Crawford's ability to break up double plays led to high production for his team. We've got another White Sox-Rays matchup here, but this time it's in the Trop. In this play that almost ended up as a crazy highlight reel for the White Sox defense, Crawford was able to just barely beat the throw to first and prevent the double play. The ball does come out of the first baseman's glove, but it looks like Crawford would have been safe regardless. Then, Evan Longoria hits a double down the left field line, and thanks to Crawford's incredible speed, he scores all the way from first. And here's some appreciation for Longoria's base running too, as he recognized the throw being made at the plate and advanced to third. I hope you're seeing right here why this team was so fantastic on the bases. We have a situation where Longoria could be on second with a double and 2 outs, but because of this team's speed and smart base running, we have a 1-0 Rays lead, Longoria on third, and only 1 out instead. It's a bunch of small moments that eventually become incredibly impactful in the long run. 2010 was a year that the Royals would prefer to forget, as they ended up at the bottom of their division with a record of 67 and 95. They were pretty bad all around, but their pitching is what hurt them the most, as their pitching staff gave up by far the most runs in the AL. The previous year was also one to forget, because in 2009, they had a slightly worse record of 65 and 97. At this point, the Royals were 7 years removed from their last above 500 season, and they hadn't won their division or even made the playoffs since 1985. So it wasn't just a rough year, it's been a rough few decades for the Royals. But don't feel too bad, as they did eventually break that playoff drought in 2014 and then won it all in 2015. As for 2010, we still have some rough times to go over. The Royals only had 1 All-Star this year, and it was Joakim Soria, who was a pitcher. So we don't exactly have a star-studded lineup here, as just 2 hitters on this team racked up an F4 higher than 2, and nobody had one over 3. Just 2 position players on the entire team were qualified hitters. The first of those was Billy Butler, who played 158 games, and the second was Yuniesky Betancourt, who played 151. After those guys, it was Jason Kendall with 118. So the team was never very consistent with their starters this year. At the very least, Butler was arguably the best hitter on the Royals that year with an OPS plus of 134, only trailing Wilson Betemy's 141. But Betemy only played 84 games. So I'd say it's Butler that was the most productive hitter on the team that year. I know I'm really hammering the nail in the coffin here, but I'd say it's finally time to look at how the base running was on this team. The Royals had an opposite situation unfold in comparison to the Rays, if you can believe that. They had a lot of people contributing negatively to their base running, while the ones who contributed positively didn't really do very much to combat it. Overall, 46 players make up this team's negative 28.4 BSR, but since we have another AL team here, we're going to cut out all the pitchers just like we did with the Rays. That leaves us with 21 position players. Most of these guys had 1 or less BSR, but these numbers clearly added up. When we take a look at each part of the team's BSR, the Royals ranked 18th in WSB, so certainly not awful, but they ranked 26th in WGDP. But where the Royals really shot themselves in the foot was with UBR. We saw with the Rays' individual players that the guys who struggled with their base running the most were the ones who struggled at advancing extra bases, and the Royals as a collective are no different. The team's UBR was by far the worst in the league that year with negative 19.6. Since 2002, and also the creation of this statistic, it's the second worst UBR in MLB history by a team, right behind the 2004 Red Sox. Alright, now let's begin to break this down and take a look at the 3 best and 3 worst base runners on the 2010 Royals. Alright, now let's begin to break this down and take a look at the 3 best and 3 worst base runners on the 2010 Kansas City Royals. Of these 21 position players that make up the 2010 Royals, only 7 of them managed to have a positive BSR. This means that 2/3 of this team were below average at base running. Since we ended the Rays section with the best base runners, let's begin the Royals section with the best base runners. I think it's only right to save the worst of the worst for last. Coming in as the 3rd best base runner on the 2010 Royals, we've got Jarrod Dyson, whose BSR was 1.5. Right off the bat, we could see that even the positive contributors weren't doing very much, as the 3rd best base runner on the Rays ranked 12th overall in the entire league that year, while Dyson comes in at 108. It's also even worse that there isn't much to analyze here with Dyson, as he only played 18 games. Dyson was a better base runner than all but 2 of his teammates in just 18 games. This was Dyson's first year in the majors, as he made his debut at the very end of the year on September 7th, 2010. Dyson's draw as a player was through his speed, as he didn't have a single season with an above average OPS plus, topping out at 96 in 2016. Over his career though, he amassed 266 stolen bases. Now this doesn't really crack the stolen base leaderboards at all, but I do think his high amount of stolen bases in such a small amount of games played is pretty impressive. Here's how each part of Dyson's BSR came out. So clearly stolen bases are where he contributed the most, and that makes sense, because when we look at the counting stats, his 90% stolen base success rate from 9 stolen bags in 10 attempts proves it. Since he had such limited playing time, he was only able to have 1 multi-steal game, and that was on September 28th in a game against the Minnesota Twins. That's my main highlight for Dyson, because he really just didn't play that many games, and therefore we don't have much to look at. Moving on to the Royals' 2nd best base runner, we've got Scott Podsednik. Podsednik was on the Royals for a very brief amount of time in his career, resulting in a 2.5 BSR in 95 games with the 2010 team. What jumps out at me immediately with him is he stole a lot of bags, even at 34 years old with the Royals. Podsednik was a prolific base stealer like Dyson, just surpassing the 300 mark in his 11-year career. Before his time with the Royals though, he stole a league-leading 70 bases for the Milwaukee Brewers in 2004. Since 2000, that's the 3rd most stolen bases by a player in a single season, so he definitely has made his mark as a base stealer. As for just this year, the stolen bases aren't how he ended up with the 2nd best BSR on the team actually. He only had a 0.8 WSP despite his proficiency at stealing. The main thing that hurt his stolen base numbers isn't the amount of steals though, as he stole 30 bases in just 95 games. Where he struggled was his efficiency, as he got caught stealing 12 times, which then led to a 71% success rate on his steals. It's not awful, but you could see why he didn't make much of an impact stealing, as being successful 30 out of 42 times is not going to give you much production. Where Podsednik really shined was through UBR, as his 1.4 runs above average was tied for the best on the team. Picking the right time to advance a base seems to be something he was really good at doing across his career too. I found a really impressive example of his high quality base running in the bottom of the 5th of a Tigers-Royals game on June 4th, 2010. Podsednik was leading off this inning against Max Scherzer and was down 0-2 in the count after missing a bunt attempt and taking strike 2. But Podsednik still gets on base with by far the weirdest swing I've seen in my entire life, but it's a hit nonetheless. Then Podsednik takes off for second and Kendall lines a hit to center field, allowing Podsednik to advance another base and stand safely at 3rd. When looking at this play, it seems like an insane gamble by Podsednik. We can see it because of the replay, but in real time it's hard to tell if this ball was caught on the fly. Yet, Podsednik barely even hesitates in his decision to go to 3rd, which then pays off for him. Honestly, I can't tell if this was an elite read or insane luck, because you could see Podsednik is committed to running to 3rd way before the ball hits the ground. If this is caught, he's easily out, and maybe that was the motivation behind his decision to run to 3rd. He was basically at 2nd already, so maybe he thought, if this is caught, I'll be out no matter what, and so I might as well keep running and gain something out of it in case it's not. That could be the case, It could also be the case that he got really lucky, but I'm just guessing here. After that, David De Jesus flies out to left, allowing Pasednik to score easily. Not only would he have not scored without his base running decision, but since this was a fly out to left, he wouldn't have been able to tag up from second either if he stayed there during the Kendall single. As for the rest of Pasednik's season with the Royals, he ended up with a 104 OPS plus by July 28th, which in combination with good base running and being on one of the league's worst teams, it meant he got traded at the deadline. It's likely that he would have had the team's best BSR if he had been there all year, but he became a Dodger by the end of July. Now it's time to move up to the best base runner on the 2010 Royals, Chris Getz. We have another guy who just didn't really play that much, as Getz wasn't that great of a hitter. In 72 games with the Royals in 2010, Getz slashed .237, .302, .277 for an OPS of 579 and an OPS plus of 61. But I don't believe his playing time was entirely hindered by performance, as he missed a decent amount of time because of injury too. By the way, if you recognize the name Chris Getz outside of his playing days, that's because he's the current general manager of the Chicago White Sox. He was hired just last year, so I'm not exactly sure if I can really bring out judgment for the way the White Sox are doing, as that team has been a bit of a disaster for a while now. But let's get back to Getz's 2010 season with the Royals. Despite his limited games, he had a BSR just barely better than Pasednik with 2.6. If we look at the counting stats, Getz stole just 15 bags that year, but at a very efficient rate, only being caught stealing 2 times. This results in a stolen base success rate of 88%. A well above average number. When we break down his BSR, it's easy to see that stealing bases is where he excelled the most. I found a game from Getz that is a little bit of a different example of what I've been showing so far, as I think it's just interesting for different reasons. We also get to see some highlights from our guy Pasednik. Here's one of Getz's stolen base games, which was on July 25th against the Yankees. In the top of the third, Getz reaches base by hitting a ball off of Phil Hughes and running it out to first. Getz then takes off for second, and it honestly looks like he got out, but the umpire calls him safe. This is a little bit before we had manager replay review, and what's called on the field is final. I know we haven't had replay for long in the grand scheme of this sport, but I've gotten so used to it that it feels weird that teams just had to deal with this kind of stuff for like over 100 years. Right after that, Pasednik drives a ball down the left field line and off the foul pole for a home run. So I kind of thought it was interesting that if this exact situation played out today, Getz would have definitely been called out after replay and only 1 run would have scored here. This might be more about replay reviews than base running, but replay has made a huge impact on the accuracy of stolen bases ever since it was implemented into the game. Back to the primary topic of base runners though, it's not like the Royals didn't have any good ones, they just didn't have the playing time. That's where the Rays make a difference, as not only did they have phenomenal base runners, but they were regular starters who easily played the entire year, allowing themselves to rack up the highest BSRs. Carl Crawford is a fantastic base runner, but if he was a terrible hitter and a decent fielder, he wouldn't have gotten nearly as many base running opportunities as he did. That's where the Royals differ from the Rays. We've looked at some really good base running for a while now, so how about we get excited to see the worst base runners on the worst base running team? Coming in with the 3rd worst BSR on the 2010 Royals, Alex Gordon earns that spot with -4.9. I would be lying if I said this is the first time I've had to talk negatively about Alex Gordon on this channel. Overall, Gordon was actually a very good base runner throughout his career, so unfortunately I'm gonna have to highlight the 1 year he struggled. This is very similar to my other video where I had to highlight the 1 year he struggled as a defender. I kind of feel bad because Gordon actually had a pretty great career with good base running and elite defense overall, but I just so happen to be highlighting the down years. I do sincerely apologize to Alex, who is not only obviously watching this video, but also definitely cares about my opinion. So how about I give Gordon some praise before I talk about the bad base running. Gordon was a Royal his entire career, and he currently has the 6th most games played in Royals history with 1,753. He also has the 6th most hits in Royals history with 1,643. He's a player who is definitely known for his defense, as the beginning and end of his career featured pretty below average hitting seasons, but he had some great hitting years in the middle. From 2011 to 2015, Gordon was a common MVP candidate and slashed .281, .359, .450 for an OPS of 809 and an OPS plus of 121. In that same time, Gordon racked up the 12th most F4 in baseball with 24.1, so he was definitely one of the league's best players in the early to mid 2010s. As for the year 2010, he only played 74 games because he spent a good amount of time in the minor leagues. During that time, he made his switch from being a full-time third baseman with some time at first base to being a left fielder. Because of his stint in the minor leagues, he only got to play in 12 games in the first half of 2010. Now, let's take a look at the counting stats first. Gordon attempted to steal 6 bases and was only successful a single time. It's a smaller sample that leads to this 31% successful steal rate, but giving the opposing team a free out that many times is still not good. So when we break down Gordon's negative 4.9 BSR, you could see he was negative across the board, but the caught stealings were what really hurt him. He had the worst WSB on the entire Royals team that year, and it's easy to see why. He also struggled going for extra bases according to his UBR. Although for Gordon, let's take a look at a few of those caught stealings just so we know what it looked like. Since there's such a small amount of them, we can get a good idea of what was going wrong. In this first caught stealing we'll look at against the Twins on April 24th, Gordon reaches base on an error and drives a run in for his team. Then, Gordon decides to steal on the first pitch, and Nick Blackburn and the Twins catch him red-handed. Also, a side thing, I feel like I don't see many pitch outs nowadays. It basically gives a free ball on the assumption that someone's gonna steal, but maybe it's just that pitch outs aren't nearly as obvious as these are. But you can clearly see they were suspecting that Gordon would steal, and they were right. An unfortunate situation, and he got read like a book. Let's look at another one. On August 17th, Gordon reaches base via a walk in the bottom of the 6th against Cleveland. Once again, Gordon is highly expected to run here as we see another pitch out, but this time Gordon is not caught in the act. On the very next pitch though, Gordon takes off and is caught stealing at second base. The throw is there in plenty of time, but I think there's a chance Gordon could have been safe here. The second baseman Jason Donald is straddling the bag, waiting for Gordon to come to him. Since the tag is applied to Gordon's chest, it ended up being a lot closer than it should have been, but I do think he's out. We know they were already highly suspecting him to run, so a good throw got him pretty easily here. In both these situations, the teams were keen on Gordon running, and the only thing that could stop them was if he didn't run, but he ran very early in both at-bats. Overall, it's not a big enough sample to call Gordon a bad base runner, especially when he has several years of very good base running, but it hurt him this year, and that's why he has the 3rd lowest BSR on the team. Moving down to the 2nd worst base runner on the 2010 Royals, we've got Jose Guillen. Guillen had played 106 games for the Royals that year and was traded at the deadline, so his 2nd worst BSR on the team of negative 5.0 only stopped from getting worse because he was no longer on the team by August 14th. Guillen has been on a lot of different teams over the years, never staying on one team for more than 3 seasons. Before he became a Royal for the first time in 2008, he was a Pirate, a Devil Ray, a Diamondback, a Red, an Athletic, an Angel, a National, and a Mariner. Something really notable that I feel needs to be pointed out is that Guillen was one of the players mentioned in the very infamous and well-known Mitchell Report. In case you don't know, the Mitchell Report was an investigation done by former United States Senator George J. Mitchell to uncover the rampant use of steroids in baseball. Of course, the steroid era is infamous in and of itself, and it was a very controversial time in baseball history. The Mitchell Report essentially outed many players as potential steroid users. The Mitchell Report is something you can easily look at as it's publicly available, so anyone could see that Guillen was indeed mentioned here a few times. His PED controversy actually continued years after this too. He had another issue at the end of the 2010 season, and it's why he was not available for a postseason roster spot by the end of the year. The reason that matters is because I mentioned before that he was traded at the deadline, and the team the Royals traded him to was the San Francisco Giants. Since Guillen didn't make the postseason roster, he did not end up winning the World Series with Pat Burrell. From what I can tell, Guillen never admitted to taking steroids, and the only thing we can do is speculate, just like with every other player mentioned here. The report says he apparently started steroid use sometime in May 2002, so I'll let you decide on your own. But let's get back to the base running. When we look at the counting stats, Guillen didn't give himself much of an opportunity to have a low WSB, as he only stole 1 bag on a single attempt. So we're gonna have to look a little closer at how he ran the bases in other scenarios. Guillen's negative 5.0 BSR is just barely lower than Gordon's 4.9, but where Gordon's was evenly spread between WSB and UBR, Guillen had one stat that truly hurts him. He had the 2nd worst UBR in the 2010 Royals with negative 4.4. So while the other 2 stats that make up his BSR are negative as well, they were not not nearly as hurtful as his UBR was. Guillen didn't take extra bases very often, doing so just 29% of the time, while the average player would do it 40% of the time. In this game in Cincinnati against the Reds on June 11th, Guillen hits a blooper that the center fielder Drew Stubbs fails to catch. Guillen pounces on that mistake and goes to second. Then Stubbs slips trying to get the ball, and Guillen proceeds to go to third, and then he's pretty easily thrown out. This entire sequence is genuinely just bad baseball and is kind of hard to watch. Guillen turned a Stubbs low light into his own low light, trying to extend his bloop single into a triple. Jose Guillen was just not a very fast player at age 34 in his career. He was never really an adept base stealer across his career either, and it led to some bad base running decisions and a lack of good ones to make up for it. If you're curious about how his BSR turned out at the end of the year when including the Giants with it too, it was negative 8.6, which is very bad and yet somehow still wouldn't be the worst on the Royals that year. After looking at 11 combined players across two teams, we've seen a lot of good base running and a lot of bad base running. But now it's time to get to the worst base runner on the worst base running team. Do you remember at the start of the Royals section, I mentioned how they had just 2 qualified players on their team? I also said that out of those 2 players, Billy Butler was easily the best position player on the team with an OPS plus of 134. He was one of the few players that actually hit well on that Royals offense. Well, unfortunately, the worst base runner on the 2010 Royals with a staggering negative 12.6 BSR is none other than Billy Butler. Butler played mostly first base with some time at DH in 2010, and he was really solid offensively. In 158 games that year, he slashed 318, 388, 469 for an OPS of 857 and an OPS plus of 134. We've been over this, but it's really great hitting for basically the entire year. However, Butler had such a horrific time on the base path that his F4 was only 2.1. The BSR is so low that it is contributing to about negative 1.3 F4. He is losing over a win above replacement just from bad base running. Similar to how Crawford had a historically fantastic base running season, this same goes for Butler, but in the other direction. Since 2002 and the creation of UBR, 2010 Billy Butler had the worst single season base running performance of all time. It's only fitting that the worst base running season by a team also features the worst base running season by a player. The funniest part is, Butler appears on this list 2 other times as well. Instead of just looking at single seasons, if we were to combine player stats in seasons since 2002, Butler would end up with the 3rd worst total BSR in that time with negative 81.2. However, you can also see he has significantly fewer games played than the players around him. Therefore, I would not say it's far-fetched to claim that Butler may be the worst base runner in MLB history. Obviously, all this stuff only goes back to 2002 because UBR only went back to 2002, but it's still very significant. So let's look into this and look at each part of the negative 12.6 BSR before the counting stats. I haven't talked about this until now, but you may have noticed that it's easy not to have a horrible WSB if you simply just don't try to steal at all. We saw exactly that with Guillen too. So since Butler didn't have a single stolen base attempt in 2010, it made it impossible for his WSB to be bad because he completely minimized the chances of those opportunities even occurring. Where Butler really struggled was obviously everywhere else. It's pretty easy to see why, as when we look at the counting stats, he led all of baseball in ground ball double plays that year with 32. 32 makes Butler tied for the 3rd most ground ball double plays in a single season since 1950. So this is a historic amount of twin killings. Lastly, it's time to look at an example to showcase why Butler had such a low UBR at negative 6.9. On April 18th, in the very first inning of this game against the Twins, Butler hits a ball the other way and it bounces off the very high right field wall in Minnesota. This ball is also played really poorly by Michael Kadire. Now obviously Butler is not very fast, but what hurts him also is just bad decision making. This ball bounces halfway back to the infield, and by the time Kadire gets to it, Butler is rounding second and on his way to third. He is then called out so easily. It wasn't even close at all. Just really questionable decision making here. Also, having 32 double plays is just brutal. I don't even really need to highlight specific examples because if you watch baseball, you know how easy it is for a double play to completely kill a team's momentum. Overall, Butler was an incredibly slow base runner who didn't make the best decisions on top of that. It's tragic that arguably the best hitter on this team was the biggest reason for their base running disaster. It leads to one of the worst base running seasons of all time and helps fuel the 2010 Royals to be one of the worst base running teams of all time. Base running is something that can be often overlooked, as stolen bases are usually the mainstream indicator, leaving other situations unnoticed. But all base running situations carry great significance, and we saw many situations where players didn't make a negative impact through stolen bases, but they did elsewhere. Or we saw examples of players that made a positive impact outside of stolen bases, and then it gets overlooked. It's important to keep in mind that base running will never make as much of an impact as hitting or fielding. A historically bad hitting or fielding season is gonna lose you a lot more production than a historically bad base running one. Even with Billy Butler's incredibly rough season on the base paths in 2010, if he was a horrific hitter and a great base runner, it would be a lot worse for him. Regardless, base running is still part of the average player's production, and once it adds up across an entire team, it can be a huge problem, or a huge strength. It just so happens to be that the best and worst teams of the 21st century and potentially beyond were in the same year. And guess what else? The very last caught stealing that the Royals had in 2010 was in their very last game of the year against none other than the Tampa Bay Rays. Two teams that will be intertwined forever, or at least until another team can be better than the Rays or worse than the Royals. Thanks for watching.